Imagine this. A billionaire standing in line at a cafe. His credit cards all get declined. People laugh, cameras come out. But then a little girl, no more than 8 years old, steps forward with a few crumpled dollars and says, "Don't worry, sir. I'll pay." What happens next will completely change his life forever. Declined. The word flashed on the screen, and the cashier's voice cut through the busy cafe like thunder. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The aroma of fresh coffee hung heavy in the air, but all eyes were fixed on the tall man in the tailored navy suit. This wasn't just any man. It was Richard Wallace, a billionaire businessman, known across the city for his sleek Rolls-Royce, private jets, and luxury lifestyle. Cameras had once followed him at red carpet events. Magazines printed his face under the words, "The Untouchable Tycoon." Yet here he stood, frozen in embarrassment, his gold credit card rejected. Richard's jaw clenched. "Run it again," he demanded. The cashier hesitated, swiped the card a second time. Declined. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he pulled out another card. This one platinum, glimmering under the cafe lights. Swipe. Declined. A murmur spread across the cafe. People began whispering, pointing. Isn't that the billionaire? How can his card not work? Must be a scam. Richard tried one more card. Still declined. For the first time in years, Richard felt his face burn with humiliation. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to failure. The billionaire, the man everyone envied, now stood helpless in front of strangers, unable to pay for something as small as a coffee and sandwich. The laughter started quietly, at first, a chuckle from a corner table, then giggles from a group of college kids. Soon, whispers turned to mocking grins. A billionaire with no money? The irony was too delicious for the crowd to ignore. Richard's lips tightened into a hard line. He could feel the weight of every stare. He had weathered hostile boardrooms, fierce competitors, and brutal deals, but never this. Never public humiliation. And then, from the back of the line, a small, gentle voice broke the tension. "Don't worry, sir. I'll pay." The cafe went silent. Everyone turned. Standing there was a little black girl, no more than 8 years old. She wore a faded pink dress and scuffed sneakers, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. In her tiny hand, she clutched a few crumpled dollar bills and a handful of coins. Her big brown eyes looked up at Richard with kindness, not judgment. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some smirked, waiting to see what would happen. Others raised their brows in disbelief. A billionaire being rescued by a child? Richard bent down slightly, lowering his voice. "Sweetheart, you don't have to." But before he could finish, the girl pressed the bills onto the counter. "Please. He needs it." The cashier glanced at Richard, then at the little girl. The bills barely covered the order, but she rang it up anyway. The receipt printed, the coffee cup slid across the counter, and just like that, the transaction was complete. The billionaire had been saved not by wealth, not by power, but by the kindness of a child. Richard stared at her, stunned. His throat tightened. Why would you do this for me?" he asked softly. The girl gave a shy smile. "My mama says we should always help people. Even if they look like they don't need it, maybe they do." Her words struck him like lightning. For a moment, Richard forgot the crowd, the whispers, the humiliation. He saw only this little girl, this stranger who had given up nearly everything in her pocket to help a man who, in the world's eyes, already had it all. She didn't know about his wealth. She didn't care about his reputation. All she saw was a human being in need. And in that moment, Richard Wallace, the billionaire who thought money could buy him the world, realized how truly poor he was. Not poor in dollars, poor in humanity, poor in kindness, poor in the very thing this little girl had in abundance. As she turned to walk away, hand in hand with her mother, Richard felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in decades, he wanted to chase, not a deal, not a fortune, not a headline, but a truth. The truth that maybe real wealth wasn't measured in credit cards, jets, or bank accounts. Maybe it was measured in the heart of a little girl with nothing to give but everything that mattered. "Sweetheart, you don't have to," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. But the little girl pushed her wrinkled dollar bills and coins toward the cashier with surprising determination. "He needs it," she said simply. The cashier hesitated, glancing at the stunned crowd, then slowly rang it up. The child's money barely covered Richard's coffee and sandwich, but she stood tall, proud of her choice. The receipt printed, the tray slid across the counter, and silence blanketed the cafe. A billionaire rescued by a child with nothing. Richard bent down to her level, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Why would you do this for me?" The girl gave a shy shrug and smiled. "My mama says we should always help people. Even if they look like they don't need it, maybe they do." The words pierced him deeper than any business rival ever had. Richard Wallace, the man with offshore accounts, private jets, and investments scattered across continents, suddenly realized he had been stripped bare. At that moment, none of it mattered. He wasn't the billionaire anymore. He was just a man, humiliated and lost, who had been saved by the pure heart of a little girl. That night, he sat alone in his mansion, staring at a glass of wine he never touched. The laughter from the cafe echoed in his head, sharp and cruel. But louder than the laughter was her voice, innocent, kind, and impossible to ignore. "Even if they look like they don't need it, maybe they do." Richard had everything the world envied, yet in his silence, he felt emptier than he ever had before. He thought about his life, the empire he built, the people he trampled to reach the top, the friends he had lost, the family he had pushed aside. He had believed money solved everything. But money had done nothing for him in that cafe. It was a child's compassion that had saved him. He barely slept. By morning, he knew one thing. He needed to see her again. The next day, Richard returned to the cafe. He scanned the room until the cashier smiled knowingly. "Looking for the little hero?" she asked. Richard nodded. The woman pointed to a corner booth where the girl sat, humming to herself, coloring on a napkin with stubby crayons. Richard approached slowly, his expensive shoes sounding strangely out of place on the worn tile floor. "Hi," he said gently. "Remember me?" The girl looked up, grinning wide. "Of course. You're the man with the funny card." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Yes, that was me. May I sit with you?" She nodded, sliding over to make room. A moment later, her mother appeared, still in her apron, her expression worried. "Sir, I hope Amara didn't disturb you yesterday." "Disturb me?" Richard interrupted, his voice full of emotion. "Ma'am, your daughter reminded me of something I forgot long ago." The mother blinked in surprise. She explained that her name was Lila, and she was a single parent working double shifts to make ends meet. Amara often waited for her after school, sketching in the cafe to pass the time. They didn't have much, but they had each other. Over the next weeks, Richard found himself returning often. Sometimes he ordered coffee, sometimes he bought nothing at all. What he really came for was Amara. He listened as she talked about her dreams, becoming a doctor, helping people who couldn't afford medicine, building a big house for her mom one day. "Why do you always smile, even when life is hard?" Richard asked her once. Amara tilted her head and answered with the kind of wisdom only children seem to have. "Because being sad won't help us, but being kind might help someone else." Her words landed heavier than any lesson Richard had ever learned in the boardroom. This little girl with worn-out shoes and only a few coins in her pocket carried more wealth in her heart than he had in all his bank accounts combined. Richard began to change. He started noticing things he had long ignored. The weary cashier's smile, the janitor sweeping late into the night, the mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. For years, he had measured worth in profit margins and stock prices. Now, he began to see value in something different: humanity. One evening, he invited Amara and her mother to his office. They sat nervously on the leather chairs, their eyes wide at the sparkling city skyline through the glass walls. Richard smiled warmly. "Amara," he began, "do you remember when you helped me in the cafe?" She nodded. "That moment changed me," he said, his voice thick. "You reminded me that real wealth isn't what's in our wallets. It's what's in our hearts. And you gave me something priceless." He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a scholarship letter for Amara, covering her education through college. Lila gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. "Sir, we could never repay this." "You already did," Richard said, emotion shining in his eyes. "Your daughter gave me back something I had lost, compassion." Amara's smile beamed brighter than the city lights. From that day forward, Richard dedicated part of his fortune to children like her. Kids with dreams, kids with hope, kids who carried more kindness in their small hands than most adults did in their entire lives. And Amara? She held tight to her dreams. Years later, she would become the doctor she promised to be, healing not only with medicine, but with the same compassion that once healed a billionaire's pride. Because one ordinary day, in a crowded cafe, a little girl with nothing performed the unthinkable, and showed a man who thought he had everything what true wealth really means. Richard couldn't shake the moment from his mind. After the girl left with her mother, he sat in his luxury car for hours, thinking. The engine was running, the leather seat comfortable beneath him, but his chest felt heavier than it had in years. He wasn't used to being vulnerable. His whole life, he believed money solved everything. Money could buy him a fleet of cars, an army of assistants, even silence when scandals threatened to touch his name. But today a child, barely 8 years old, had saved him in a way his fortune never could. That night, as he walked through the marble halls of his mansion, he couldn't bring himself to enjoy it. The chandeliers sparkled. The art on the walls cost more than most families earned in a year. Yet none of it gave him peace. He poured himself a glass of his finest wine, but it sat untouched on the table. All he could hear was that small, steady voice. Even if they look like they don't need it, maybe they do. The next morning, unable to fight the urge any longer, Richard returned to the cafe. He wasn't there for the coffee. He was there for answers. When he walked in, the same cashier who had witnessed the scene smiled knowingly. "Looking for someone?" Richard gave a small nod, and she pointed toward a corner booth. There, sitting cross-legged with crayons spread across napkins, was the little girl. She hummed softly as she drew, the sunlight from the window catching her ribbon-tied hair. Richard approached, his heart oddly nervous. He cleared his throat. "Hi, remember me?" The little girl looked up with wide brown eyes, and then broke into a grin. "The man with the funny card." He chuckled awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Yes, that's me. May I sit?" She nodded quickly, moving her crayons aside. A moment later, her mother appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked worried, her voice rushed. "Sir, I hope she didn't bother you yesterday." "Bother me?" Richard interrupted, shaking his head with emotion in his voice. "She saved me." The woman blinked, taken aback by his sincerity. "Her name's Amara," the mother said softly. Richard smiled. "That's a beautiful name." He looked at the little girl again. "Amara, you did something yesterday that I'll never forget." Her mother gave a small laugh, though her eyes were tired. "She's always been like this. We don't have much, but Amara believes kindness is the richest thing you can give." Those words struck Richard harder than any deal he had ever closed. For years, he measured success in numbers, in contracts signed, in wealth accumulated. Yet here was a woman who worked long hours and a little girl with only a few coins in her pocket, and they seemed to have discovered a truth he had missed all along. Richard kept coming back. Day after day, he found himself drawn to the little booth in the corner. Sometimes he bought a coffee. Other times, he bought nothing at all. What he really came for was Amara's company. She would chatter about her drawings, her dreams, her small adventures at school. She spoke about wanting to be a doctor one day, so I can help people who can't afford to pay. Her words carried no bitterness, only hope. One afternoon, as she colored, Richard asked, "Amara, why do you always smile even when things are hard?" She looked up, her crayon paused mid-stroke. Then she said something so simple it left him speechless. "Because being sad won't help us, but being kind might help someone else." Richard's throat tightened. This child, with her wisdom and innocence, had given him more than boardrooms and billionaires ever had. She reminded him of the humanity he had lost in his race for power. Slowly, Richard began to change. He started noticing the people he once ignored. The janitor sweeping late at night, the driver who waited hours in silence, the waitress who served with a tired smile. For years, he had thought himself untouchable, living above the ordinary struggles of life. But now he realized that true strength came not from wealth, but from compassion. Weeks later, he invited Amara and her mother to his office high above the city. The glass walls stretched to the sky, and the skyline glittered below. They sat nervously on the leather chairs, clearly unused to such extravagance. Richard leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Amara, do you remember when you helped me at the cafe?" She nodded quickly. "That moment changed me," Richard said. His eyes softened. "You showed me that real wealth isn't what we keep in banks or cards. It's what we give." He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a letter granting Amara a full scholarship to the best private school in the city, all expenses paid until college. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. "Sir, we could never repay this." Richard shook his head. "You already did. Your daughter gave me something I didn't even know I had lost, my humanity." Amara's smile lit up the room, brighter than all the skyscraper lights below. From that day forward, Richard dedicated a large part of his fortune to helping children like her. Kids with dreams bigger than their circumstances. Kids who reminded the world that kindness was the greatest wealth of all. And Amara? She never stopped believing in that lesson. Years later, she became the doctor she dreamed of being. And whenever she healed someone, she carried with her the same belief that once changed a billionaire's heart. Kindness is the richest thing you can ever give. Over the next few weeks, Richard visited often. Sometimes he bought coffee, but most of the time, he simply sat in the corner booth and listened to Amara talk. She was so full of life, her little hands moving excitedly as she described her dreams. She wanted to be a doctor, not just any doctor, she said, but the kind who helps people who don't have money for medicine. She told Richard about her mother, who worked double shifts just to keep a roof over their heads. And yet, through it all, Amara never complained. Instead, she smiled. Her laughter rang out like music in the small cafe, lifting even the heaviest of days. Richard found himself waiting for those moments, hungry for her stories, her joy, her simple but powerful way of seeing the world. One afternoon, unable to contain his curiosity, Richard leaned forward. "Amara, can I ask you something?" She tilted her head and smiled. "Of course." "Why do you always smile, even when life is hard?" The little girl paused, her crayon hovering above the napkin where she had been sketching a little house with a garden. Then she looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 8 years. "Because being sad won't help us," she said simply. "But being kind might help someone else." The words struck him like a bolt of lightning. Richard sat back, stunned. He had spent his entire life chasing money, power, and status. He had worked day and night to build his empire, stepping over rivals, ignoring friends, even losing the closeness of his family in his pursuit of wealth. He had thought money was the answer to everything. Yet here was a little girl with nothing but a handful of coins and an endless supply of kindness, teaching him a truth his billions had never revealed. That night, Richard lay awake in his massive bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake her words. Being sad won't help us, but being kind might help someone else. He thought about his own life. When had he last done something simply to help? When had he given without expecting something in return? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't remember. Days turned into weeks, and Richard's visits to the cafe became a habit. The staff grew used to the sight of the billionaire sitting quietly with a little girl, listening more than speaking. And though people whispered, Richard didn't care. He had found something money couldn't buy: perspective. Amara reminded him of what truly mattered. She showed him joy in the smallest things: a drawing on a napkin, a funny story from school, the pride in her eyes when she talked about her hard-working mother. She saw the world not for what it lacked, but for what it could be. And slowly, Richard began to change. He noticed the janitor who swept his office late at night and thanked him. He began to ask his driver about his family. He even found himself arriving home earlier, realizing for the first time that his mansion felt more like a prison than a palace. One evening, after much thought, Richard invited Amara and her mother to his office. They came hesitantly, both dressed in their best clothes, though he could tell they weren't used to such luxury. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline, the city glowing like jewels below. Richard smiled warmly as they sat across from him. "Amara, do you remember when you helped me at the cafe?" She giggled. "Of course. You couldn't pay for your sandwich." He laughed softly. "Yes, that's true. But what you don't know is that day changed me. You reminded me of something I had forgotten a long time ago, that true wealth isn't in money, but in kindness." He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a letter of acceptance to the best private school in the city, with all expenses paid until college. Amara's mother gasped, her hands trembling as she opened the letter. "Sir, this is too much. We could never." Richard interrupted, his voice gentle. "You already have. Your daughter gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost, my heart." Tears filled the mother's eyes, and she covered her mouth in disbelief. Amara, however, simply smiled the same bright smile she always did, the kind that could light up the darkest room. From that day forward, Richard made a promise, not just to Amara, but to himself. He dedicated a large portion of his fortune to children like her, kids with dreams bigger than their circumstances, kids who believed in kindness, even when the world gave them little reason to. He set up scholarships, funded hospitals, and invested in programs that gave hope to the ones who needed it most. And Amara? She never stopped smiling. She grew up holding onto the same belief that had touched Richard's heart. Years later, she did become the doctor she dreamed of being. And when she treated her patients, she carried with her the same lesson she had once shared with a billionaire, that sadness changes nothing, but kindness can change the world. Richard Wallace, the man who once believed money solved everything, discovered that his greatest fortune was not measured in dollars, but in the simple wisdom of a little girl who had nothing, except the heart to give everything. Because sometimes the richest person in the room isn't the one with the biggest bank account, but the one with the kindest soul. Weeks later, Richard invited Amara and her mother to his office. They looked nervous as they stepped inside, their eyes wide at the glittering skyscrapers that surrounded the tall building. The lobby alone felt overwhelming, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and businessmen hurrying past in sharp suits. For a woman who worked double shifts at a small cafe and a little girl who spent afternoons coloring on napkins, this world seemed like another planet. Richard walked forward with a smile that was warmer than the one he usually wore in business meetings. He extended his hand toward Amara. "I'm glad you came," he said. His voice was gentle, without the cold edge his employees were used to. They rode the elevator up to the top floor, and when the doors opened, Amara gasped. His office stretched across an entire level, with walls of glass that displayed the entire city skyline. From so high above, the streets looked like winding ribbons of light, and the buildings sparkled like stars. Amara pressed her nose to the glass, whispering, "It looks like magic." Her mother touched her shoulder gently. "Don't lean on the window, sweetheart." She looked at Richard nervously. "Sir, we don't belong in places like this. I don't know why you invited us, but—" Richard raised his hand kindly. "Please, don't be uncomfortable. You both belong here more than anyone I've ever had in this office." He motioned for them to sit. Amara perched on the edge of a leather chair, her small feet dangling far above the ground. She swung them back and forth nervously, but her wide eyes kept roaming the room in awe. Richard leaned forward, his expression serious but tender. "Amara, do you remember when you helped me in the cafe?" She giggled softly. "Of course I do. You couldn't pay for your coffee." Even her mother cracked a smile, though her eyes remained watchful. Richard chuckled. "Yes, that's true. But what you don't know is that moment changed me. I realized I had been living my entire life for myself, for wealth, for power, for recognition. And you, Amara, showed me what real wealth is." He reached into his drawer and pulled out an envelope. Slowly, he handed it to her. Amara blinked, her small fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a letter printed on elegant stationery. She stared at it, confused. Her mother leaned closer, and as her eyes scanned the words, tears immediately welled up. Her hand flew to her mouth. A full scholarship? to Crestwood Academy. Her voice cracked. Sir, this is the best school in the city. It's a dream we could never even think of affording. Richard nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. Yes. And not just Crestwood. I'll cover every cost until Amara finishes college. Tuition, books, everything she needs. Amara's mother shook her head, overwhelmed. Sir, we could never repay this. It's too much. Richard leaned back, his gaze steady. You already gave me more than I could ever repay. That day, in the cafe, Amara gave me something I'd lost long ago, my humanity. She reminded me that money is meaningless if it's not used to help others. So, in truth, I'm the one in your debt. Tears streamed down the woman's cheeks as she clasped her daughter's hand. Amara, however, simply looked at Richard with that same bright smile that had captivated him weeks earlier. Thank you, she said softly. But I still think helping people is the best kind of rich. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Out of the mouths of children came truths more powerful than all the speeches he had ever heard. From that day forward, Richard's life changed. He no longer measured success by the rise of his stocks or the headlines in glossy magazines. Instead, he found meaning in what he gave. He dedicated a large portion of his fortune to children like Amara, kids with dreams but little opportunity, kids with hope but few resources, kids who carried more kindness in their small hearts than most adults did in their entire lives. He funded scholarships, built libraries in underprivileged neighborhoods, and supported hospitals that treated families who couldn't pay. Each act of giving reminded him of Amara and the way her small hand had pushed those crumpled bills across the cafe counter. And Amara? She carried the scholarship with pride. She studied hard, knowing that her education was a gift, but also a responsibility. She never forgot the lesson she had learned from her mother, that kindness was the richest thing you could give. Years passed, and Amara grew into the woman she had always dreamed of becoming. She became a doctor, but not the kind who only wore expensive suits and treated the wealthy. She worked in community hospitals, in clinics where people came in desperate and hopeless, unable to pay. She healed with medicine, yes, but more importantly, she healed with compassion. Patients left her office not just healthier, but lighter, because she cared for them as people, not as bills. And Richard? He never stopped visiting her, even as she grew older. He watched with pride as the little girl who once saved him in a cafe grew into a woman, saving countless others. In his final years, when his body grew weaker and the empire he had built was run by others, Richard often said, "The greatest investment I ever made wasn't in stocks or companies. It was in a little girl named Amara." Because once upon a time, a child with nothing had performed the unthinkable. She had rescued a billionaire with everything. And in doing so, she taught him the most valuable truth, that real wealth has nothing to do with the size of your bank account, and everything to do with the size of your heart. And that's the incredible story of how a little girl's unthinkable act taught a billionaire the true meaning of wealth. Not in money, but in kindness. If this story inspired you, give this video a like. It helps more people see it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that touch the heart. Until next time, remember, even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's world.